So, thank you. So as Joseph pointed out, I'm not here to talk about CEF specifically or any of the sort of top-down European level initiatives. There are many people in this room that are far more able to talk about that than I am. What I'm here to talk about is something of a story from the front line, where we're talking about not just connecting people across borders, but in the case of Ireland, we're actually talking about language rights and connecting people within our own country, where we're facing some specific challenges with regards to the Irish language. This is joint work with myself and my colleague Aidan McCormack, who's actually in the Irish government and couldn't be here today to present this with me, so I hope I do his work justice as well. I'll start off with just a little bit of history, because you'd be surprised at the amount of people that don't realise that Irish is in fact a language in its own right, and that we don't just all speak English. So Irish, or Gaeilge in the native tongue, is a Celtic language which is native to Ireland. It's also our first official language, with English also being there as an official language, but in the second place. There was a time when Irish was the most widely spoken language in the country. That's no longer the case. It's very much English. By the 1800s, due to various historical factors, a little more than half the population of the country spoke Irish as their main language, and the other half would have been English and some other regional languages as well. Sorry. In the mid-1800s, the number of speakers of the Irish language peaked at about 3.5 million, but this was still only about half the actual population of the country. Further events in history meant that by the start of the 20th century, we were down to less than 1 million speakers, in fact, just over 500,000 speakers of Irish in the country, at about 13% of the population. Happy to say that this is no longer the case. Our last census, which was 100 years after that previous statistic, we're up to almost half of the country can speak Irish. It is still spoken natively in a number of regions. You can see that it's mapped out here that those dark spots there are where the language is spoken more frequently, and you can see that these regions are called Gaeltacht regions, and they jump out quite clearly there. However, if we separate education out of the picture, the result is quite different. There's less than 2% of the population outside of the education system actually speak the language. And in recent years, inside of the education system, there's actually been something of what's been labelled an urban revival in the language, whereby it's become quite in vogue to send your children to an Irish language medium school. So there is something of a resurgence in around the urban areas, but even still, it's outside of education, there's less than 2% of the population actually speak Irish on a daily basis. With the establishment of the Irish Free State and subsequently then the Irish Republic, significant resources were allocated to the protection and preservation of the Irish language. So, for example, it is still a required subject in education, and it was introduced as well as a requirement to move into professions like teaching, the civil service, police, practicing law, and many others. And that had quite a positive effect, and in a very short period of time, by 1926, we had almost 20% of the population speaking Irish, whereas prior to the foundation of the Free State, that was closer to 13-14%. More recently, the Constitution has been supplemented with a number of legislative actions, both within Ireland and across Europe. So in 1973, we joined the EEC, and Irish was made a treaty language of the then EEC, which meant that our citizens could correspond in written Irish with EU institutions, and there were some other language rights afforded to them. In 1999, the British-Irish Agreement Act, or the Good Friday Agreement as it's more commonly referred to as, this recognised the Irish language as part of the cultural heritage and wealth of the island of Ireland. So that meant that it was recognised by the British government as well as the Irish government. So this was quite a significant development, both sides of the border in Ireland. We then, in 2003, passed an Official Languages Act. This was in response to a movement that forced the government's hand, really, I suppose, about people's language rights not being respected within the country, that the public bodies weren't following the due procedures, or weren't always, I should say, following due procedures to communicate bilingually or to publish all of their content, legislation and so on bilingually as well. So this Language Act established a language commissioner, the Commissioner Tonga, whose role is to monitor and enforce this for all public bodies. After a unanimous decision by foreign ministers within the Union in 2005, Irish was made an official working language in 2007. There's a partial derogation on that, which is still in place today, but that's hopefully going to be lifted at some point, which will mean that there's a lot more translation work, and hence we're getting to the root of the problem here that this project is looking to address. And then a couple of years ago, internally within Ireland, we passed a Gaeltacht Act, which gave statutory effect to a 20-year strategy for Irish. And if not for this act, if not for this strategy document, I should say, the project that I have currently running would never have been able to happen. So it's quite a significant step forward for the language and for language rights. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working with a department of the Irish government in this work. It's the Department of Arts, Heritage and Gaeltacht. For simplicity, I'm just going to refer to it as the department, or simply just DAG, D-A-H-G, because it's quite a lot to say. They have quite a broad remit for the built and natural heritage, arts, film, culture, and so on. But we're fortunate enough that within this department, there's a dedicated Minister of State with responsibility for the Irish language. So the language isn't being lost in the midst of all of this. There is a dedicated minister there to take care of this aspect, and he has quite an extensive team. So when looking at the translation need of this one government department, we need to consider the fact that because of our constitutional obligations and our legal obligations, all departments within the Irish government are obliged to provide content in Irish, and additionally they must be able to correspond in Irish with the public. These are our basic language rights. So when we were looking at addressing the needs specific to the Department of Arts, Heritage and Gaeltacht, they have an in-house translation team, naturally enough, and their working language in the department is in fact Irish. So their support staff are all fluent speakers and are quite capable to converse in Irish and to deal with the correspondence. So you could look at it that they have it quite easy. However, many of the other departments, so for example, I would say finance, would often call on this department when they receive correspondence in Irish to help their staff. So they're seen as a first port of call for Irish language matters as regards actually fulfilling their other departments' obligations under the Languages Act. Additionally, there's a translation team for the Houses of the Oireachtas, which would be the Parliament buildings itself, that's independent of the translation team in the department that I've been working with. So there are multiple players working here, all with similar translation needs, and everybody treating the Department of Arts, Heritage and Gaeltacht as a central hub. Despite all this, there's still a lot of translation work that needs to be outsourced, and that has an additional cost that really we could consider doing something about. So here's a breakdown of a typical cost for quite a number of the departments. I don't have them all there because all of the data wasn't actually available. You can see the numbers are relatively small in the grander scheme of things, but what needs to be factored in is that additionally, many of the departments employ a translator as well, specifically to deal with this, so their salary costs need to be factored in. And as well as that, this isn't the whole story. There's a lot of government material that can't be outsourced, so can't be reflected in these kind of numbers. Either way, when we sum up all the costs involved, it comes to less than €1 million. So it's not a large amount of money in the grander scheme of things, particularly when we're talking about longer programs in Horizon 2020 and CEF. This means that this is very much a departmental problem that's internal to the Irish government, and we can't look externally for someone to solve this problem. That the Department of Arts, Heritage and Gaeltacht have realised that they need to address this themselves through their own translation practices. So, quick look at their current translation practices. Everything is fully human translated. That makes for great quality, I have to admit. However, consistency is somewhat lacking. They've only recently started using CAT tools, that off the basis of the fact that their staff are all coming from different backgrounds, but they're fluent speakers. The assumption was that we can just get away with our own staff. They can do these translations on the fly. As pressure increased, they realized they need to start looking at tooling, and they've started using Trados recently. However, it hasn't gone much further than that. There's no specific language tools. The resources that the individuals and the translators are using within the department, they're not shared. Everybody has their own translation memory, and there's no interconnection, and from a consistency point of view, they're noticing increasing problems due to a lack of terminology management. Now, these are all things that modern CAT tools can do, but they're either not being used or they're not being developed for Irish. And there's certainly no machine translation involved at this stage. So moving forward, last year, the government took a decision and passed some legislation that authorised various initiatives, the important one being this notion of a shared translation service to meet the Irish language requirements of all government departments. So not quite an MT at EC, but an MT at Dublin, we'll call it. This shared translation service is going to operate within the department's language policy division and be available as a shared service for all government departments. The intention being that when this is successful, that we can expand it and roll it out by scaling it up to other languages for other departments, because we do have a significant immigrant population. And one fact about the Irish language that I didn't put in the slide is that we have more native speakers of Polish in Ireland than we do native speakers of Irish by an order of magnitude, actually. So you can imagine that in, for example, the departments of children, where these people are bringing up their children in other European languages, that this becomes relevant. So the intention with the department here is to become the example, the illustrative example of best practice to reform the translation practices across the entire Irish government, all departments, for all languages. And crucially, given that we're coming to hopefully the end of the recent fiscal crisis, we're creating some jobs out of this as well. So straight off the bat, that for this shared translation service within the department, there's 4 jobs, and this will increase then as we're scaling it up, hopefully. The specific role of the shared translation service is to prioritise the day-to-day translation requirements of the various departments and to assist with the translation of support material. So we're talking about the parliamentary questions, speeches, press releases, and general correspondence. The general correspondence being one that was a specific snag point for many of the departments. And when they then contacted the Department of Arts, Heritage and Gaeltacht, the process slowed down. It led to increased consumer dissatisfaction and people complaining to the language commissioner that their rights weren't being respected. Additionally, the role of the STS is going to provide an advisory service to avoid duplication, because as we dug into this, we saw that much of the exact same texts were being translated by different departments, and we were paying for them 2, 3, even up to 5 or 6 times. So this is something that obviously needs to be rooted out, and this is very much part of the remit of this shared translation service. So what's the role of machine translation within this service? It's clearly a large team. There are many players at stake. When I caught eyes of a report from the department to the cabinet on this shared translation service, I was surprised and pleased to see that they had realised the importance of machine translation. They realised that it is central to the successful implementation of this plan and to the achievement of any sort of cost savings that are applicable here. So with all this in mind, we move forward to actually develop a machine translation engine with the department. Now, what we need to bear in mind is that there's absolutely no in-house knowledge or experience of machine translation, in practice at least, within the staff at the department, save for their interactions with the free online services. And I'm sure you can imagine that there's a significant negative perception there that, oh, the quality isn't good enough, or from the translator's point of view, they were concerned that this might be something that could try and take their job from them. Or at the very least belittle their role, and there was a very significant negative perception there. On the other hand, throughout the department, but quite strongly at the senior management level and right up to the minister, there was a very strong will to modernise. They realised that they needed to do something, and that it needed to involve technology in some way if they were to establish best practice in translation. And the translators themselves did realise that, but they were a little bit lost as to how exactly that would be realised. This attitude, I have to say, was largely due to the result of the MetaNet white papers, the strategic research agenda, and the corresponding outreach campaigns, that it struck home and really made a clear message that Ireland, if we want to respect our language rights, we need to modernise in this area. So, to move it forward, we started out meeting with the translators themselves. We discussed with them their workloads, problem cases, consistency issues, and so on. And we had a look at their workflows, which at that stage were only using translation memories, or in many cases, they actually weren't using translation memory at all. They just simply had the source document open in one window, a blank document in another, and they were typing away, and all this was being lost, that this could be reused. Based on those discussions, we established a use case to trial some sort of a machine translation implementation, and we followed it up with a mock-up of how this would work, showing the translators that their role was very much central in the use of machine translation and in the shared translation service itself. Once they saw that mock-up, it was a very, very easy sell, I have to admit. They were very much convinced that this was a good thing. So we moved forward and we started talking about resources and putting forward the case for actually sharing these resources that the government is going to generate. So there's definitely a severe data shortage for anything in the Irish language when we look at language technologies. There are various translation memories available of legislative texts. I think one of the speakers yesterday mentioned that there was a time when legislators were paid by the word. I think that's very much still the case in Ireland, because the sentences were very long-winded, used a very specific style and vocabulary, and when we looked at that in comparison with the use case that had been given to this shared translation service, it just wasn't fit for purpose. There were some translation memories available internally within the department, but I think you've got the impression that they were somewhat disorganized about this. There was no real management or reuse, and in many cases they were reinventing the wheel. So, for example, a translator would leave the organization to a new role. His or her computer would be wiped. Translation memory's gone. New person comes in. We start again from scratch. With all this in mind, we were able to put forward the case for sharing this public data. If we go back to the use case, we're talking about speeches, parliamentary questions. All this stuff is in the public domain already. There's no confidentiality issue. The positives for us as a language technology community is that means that if we can put that out there, the data is there and we can reuse it, establish a community of interest. And for the government and the government departments, they increase consistency and control over what's happening with this data, and they can stop having to reinvent the wheel. With this case put forward, the principle now for the ongoing work is that we're going to share the data whenever possible. This is at the core of the shared translation service for Irish, and I would anticipate that as this is rolled out to other languages, that this will be applicable as well for the entire service. And also, as we improve their workflows, we should be generating more data as we're going, because the initial investigations uncovered really just about 30,000 parallel sentences, so it pales into insignificance compared to what's available for Latvian, which is another small, we'll call it, European language. So the scope for the project that we put together was threefold. We wanted to establish the viability of developing this engine, test its integration into their workflows and see if it is actually usable, and measure the impact. We established the use case directly with the department translators, and they were able to supply us with a test of documents representative of this. To develop the engine, we initially combined the existing resources that were available publicly into a baseline system. You can imagine the results from that were quite poor. We then followed up by crawling public information, sources that were available online, so stuff that had already been published but that maybe wasn't captured in the translation memories that we were able to get from the department. We integrated this new data, and that led to a very significant improvement on the automated testing, which isn't very surprising, but crucially we were able to start outperforming the free online services for our use case. So this meant that we could move forward. We moved forward by doing a small-scale integration test to look at the feasibility of an MT-based solution in this shared translation service and measure how it would impact productivity. This experiment was done with one of the department's translators and gave us an awful lot of interesting results to look at. The overwhelming result was just how positive the impression that this new system made on their translator. In the post-experiment interview, she was really quite excited about the prospects for this and how this would help her and her team. When we looked at the data, there was no negative impact on the productivity, and we were also able to see that for certain document types, we were able to get an increase in excess of 50% productivity. So we deemed that this was reasonable, that this was something we should move forward with. So our next steps. The department themselves are updating their translation tooling and their infrastructure, I'm very pleased to say. They're also updating their policies around it, so they're modernizing in anticipation of rolling out a full shared translation service. The data sparsity problem does still exist. However, the department have realized this and are helping to collect everything together to improve their their systems. We also have an in-house deployment of the engine that we had in the pilot phase. So it's currently being rolled out in its very much prototype state to all of the translators in the department. And they're working together with us in the ADAPT Centre to do some further work around improving the engine. And our role in that is largely, as well as improving the core engine, but it's around identifying which resources should and could be shared and reused for optimal benefit. Thank you.